Good afternoon, honored guests, dear Aaltonians. I'm Ilkka Niemelä, and as president of Aalto University, I'm very happy to welcome you to celebrate 4 scholars that have taken new roles at Aalto as tenured professors. These exceptional scholars demonstrate the qualities that are at the heart of Aalto's mission. By continuous striving for excellence in research, education, and societal impact, they expand our understanding of the world and our ability to improve it. Their scholarship and dedication are an example and an inspiration. These installation talks are a proud tradition at Aalto. They are a special moment for our community. We come together to celebrate these professors, to hear about the journey that brought them here, the curiosity that drives them, and their vision for the future. We are gathered today to congratulate them medical engineering to management, economics, and bioproducts. A diversity of ideas and approaches that enriches our community. Faced with problems in a world changing in an increasing pace, we need a richness of ideas. We need the boldness and creativity to try different paths. Today, we will hear about some of those ideas and the hard work behind them. I hope that this will help us challenge our assumptions and see the world in a different way. Encounters providing novel perspectives spark new ideas, and creativity often comes from seeing a familiar thing in an unfamiliar light. Dear new tenured professors, as you move forward in your journey, I hope you will continue to explore new perspectives and form new collaborations. Our community has a wealth of expertise and talent that can fuel new discoveries and bold ideas. Let's continue to connect with each other across disciplines and practices so we can build new solutions and better, more sustainable future. Along the way, let our shared values of responsibility, courage, and collaboration guide you in your research and in your teaching. Share them with your students and with each other. Add a touch of radical creativity and an entrepreneurial mindset. With those values and this community, anything is possible. Dear new tenured professors, I want to congratulate you on your new role in our community. I hope today will be a moment in your career that you will look back on fondly. A moment of achievement and celebration. In honor of your appointment, I will now invite you individually to receive your appointment letters. Professor Koen Van Leemput. Dr. Koen Van Leemput is hereby appointed to the position of full professor of AI Health from 1st of February 2023 at the Aalto University School of Science. Warm congratulations. Professor Jukka Luoma. Kauppatieteiden tohtori Jukka Luoma on nimitetty 1. helmikuuta 2023 alkaen strategisen johtamisen professoriksi Aalto-yliopiston perustieteiden korkeakouluun. Lämpimät onnittelut. Professor Tiina Nypelö. Tekniikan tohtori Tiina Nypelö on nimitetty 1. tammikuuta 2023 alkaen lignocelluloosan kemian professoriksi Aalto-yliopiston kemian tekniikan korkeakouluun. Lämpimät onnittelut. Professor Matti Sarvimäki. Kauppatieteiden tohtori Matti Sarvimäki on nimitetty 1. marraskuuta 2022 alkaen sovelletun mikrotaloustieteen professoriksi Aalto-yliopiston kauppakorkeakouluun. Lämpimät onnittelut.
We are moving to the next step of the program, which is the presentations by our new tenured professors. My name is Tiina Nypelö. I serve in the provost role here in Aalto University, overseeing all academic affairs. And it's my honor to introduce each of the 4 professors, or in fact, their department heads who will introduce the professors. And as the first one, I have the pleasure inviting the head of the Department of Neuroscience and Biomedical Engineering from the School of Science, Matti Hämäläinen, on stage. Please, Matti.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Koen Van Leemput, who started as a professor of AI health in our department in the beginning of this year. He is well known for developing new methods for analyzing medical images with AI, often with the focus on magnetic resonance images, MRIs. He is internationally well known for this work in computational neuroimaging. He has led several large research projects in the field, and in particular, many of the tools originating from his research are included in the widely used FreeSurfer, an open source software package originally developed at the Martinos Center of Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Now, since Koen's field is AI health, I think it's most befitting that I end my introduction with 3 verses of a poem written not by me, but ChatGPT. Koen Van Leemput, a name so rare in the world of neuroscience, he has a flair. His work with MRI is so profound, unlocks secrets of the brain previously unbound. With MRI, he captures images so clear of the brain structure with no fear. But by decoding the images, he seeks to see the brain's inner workings so unique. From aging to disease, his work reveals the brain's complexity with such appeal. And Koen's work already inspired the generation to unlock the mysteries of the brain with much dedication. So today, Professor Van Leemput's topic is indeed artificial intelligence in medical imaging, from research to clinical practice. a title which emphasizes the need for the new methods to work on clinical images rather than only on cherry-picked test datasets. Please.
Thanks, Matti, for the nice introduction. I didn't see the ChatGPT coming. So I'm going to talk for the next 15 minutes about artificial intelligence, AI, in medical imaging. And so the first question I'm going to put out is, why in the first place do we need AI in medical imaging? And I'll give one answer immediately. So one good reason is the explosion of data that you see in hospitals, digital data that's acquired over the years. So if you look at the last few decades, the amount of images that are acquired has grown exponentially. And that's because that's mainly driven by modalities such as computed tomography and CT or magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. So these are three-dimensional volumes that contain hundreds of individual two-dimensional images. And so people have just acquired more of these exams with high resolution, with different contrasts. So there's really an explosion of data. The number of radiologists, so medical doctors who are supposed to read these images, look at them and interpret them, hasn't grown in the same pace. So these people right now are facing a torrent of data that they have to analyze. So they get only a few seconds per image before they need to move on to the next one. Obviously, they're not supposed to miss any signals in the data. They're very stressed, and obviously AI seems like a perfect tool to help these people. So more generally, AI in medical imaging is used in two places. One is in acquiring data. So you get a scanner, you get images out. AI can help you get the data out faster, which is nice for the patient. Doesn't need to be in a very tight tube for a long time. Chances of accidentally moving while you're taking the images has decreased. And also you just get much better images. So higher resolution, less noise. I'm not going to talk about that part of AI. What I will talk about is about another phase, which is starting from existing images to extract useful information out of it. And in this case, I show so-called segmentation, which is a delineation of different structures. So you can analyze, for instance, volume or use it in your treatment planning. But it can also be some automatic diagnosis or checking whether a certain medication is working for a specific patient. And there is sort of two or three points that I would like to bring forward where AI can really help. And one is exposing things that you cannot just see by the naked eye. One is to measure more consistently, and the other one is to analyze much, much faster than humans can do. And I'll give an example of each. So here's an example of things that you can't see with the naked eye. Imagine you're working in a hospital, you take an MRI scan of someone, and you've seen that patient before, and now your task is to compare the two images to see if you can detect tiny differences. And obviously that's a problem because, first of all, the differences are really, really small, maybe a fraction of a percent over this time period. And the patient, of course, is not in exactly the same position between the two scan sessions. Another example is shown here. So that's an application in radiation therapy. You have an MRI scan, which shows a tumor, so the soft tissue. You also have a CT scan, which shows the bones, which you need to calculate a treatment plan because the bones, they tend to block the radiation. And of course, the patient is lying in two different scanners, so the body has moved, and so they are not really compatible with one another. And so what you can do with AI is pretend that the MRI is kind of printed on the rubber type of material and locally stretch it to make the anatomies match. Here's another example where AI can help to measure more consistently. So that's an example in multiple sclerosis. So what's important here is that the brain has lesions, essentially a type of scar tissue. And what's important is both the number and the volume of these lesions, and especially as they evolve over time. So here, 7 different human experts were asked to delineate these lesions. And what you see is that there is enormous inconsistencies between the opinion between these experts, up to a fraction of 3 or 4 times more lesions or more volume between different raters. Then I said analyzing images faster is an application area. So we're looking at an MRI scan, a brain MRI scan, with a complete so-called segmentation, so delineation of maybe 40 different structures. That's useful in scientific studies, analyzing how diseases affect brain structures. And if I ask an expert to manually delineate these images, so generate an image on the right, how long do you think approximately this will take? Would 3 hours be more or less, realistic? Maybe I can ask to raise hands if you think 3 hours is enough. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so not many people think 3 hours, and that's correct. It takes almost 1 week. So it's a very tough task to do. And with AI, you can actually completely solve this problem within a few minutes on my laptop. I can get the result. Okay, so now I've offered lots of solutions. AI is fantastic. So what's actually the problem? And so the problem is to bring these tools into a clinical practice. And one example is shown here. So let's say I go to a local hospital and I want to write a software tool that can automatically analyze all the brain scans that are required in that hospital. And you'll see there is a whole lot of things going on here in sort of this wild setting. One is that the first indicated with number 1 is that you get different scanners. So if you have a method that works very well for scanner 1, maybe it doesn't work very well for scanner 2. There's lots of knobs you can turn in the scanner, like the image resolution in 3 different directions, of course. It's a volumetric image. Different contrast, there's different modalities. I already mentioned CT, MR. There's also PET scans for to see functional information. Of course, these people are in the hospital, so there's lots of different diseases going on. You might have people that come that you've seen before, but you don't know. Some patients you've seen only once, some you've seen 5 times. So there's a lot of variability there. And I call that the imaging zoo. Okay? So if I formulate the problem, what we're trying to do, we try to go from images to useful information. That's by itself not so difficult, but doing it in a sort of realistic clinical setting where you have all this variation going on, that's hard. The other problem is interpretability. Let's say I have an AI that predicts for a cancer patient how long they're going to live. And I now have a patient that predicts, this person, the treatment is not working, this person is going to die soon. That's, of course, very useful information. Then the clinician might decide to actually focus more on the quality of life rather than very intensive treatments. But of course, the person is making the decisions is going to want more than just some computer who says this person is going to die soon, right? And presenting evidence, building trust, that's actually a very hard thing to do. The other thing is uncertainty. Is the computer 99% certain that some diagnosis is true, or only 50%? Makes a huge difference. Okay, so now I've listed all the problems. What are the solutions? So the solution I've concentrated on in my research is so-called analysis by synthesis. So we want to take images and analyze them, and the way we can solve these problems is by turning the whole thing around. So I start with some quantity of interest. Let's say I want to diagnose Alzheimer's. Then I learn how to model images of Alzheimer's patients. So I generate images randomly that look like images of Alzheimer's cases. When you do that, you can actually then invert the model to get the answers you're looking for. And that kind of solves all our 3 issues of the imaging zoo, of the uncertainty, and interpretability. And I'll show 2 examples. So let's start with the imaging zoo. Setting is that you want to automatically segment some data that coming from some hospital acquired in some way you have no control over. So the way it works is, looking at a forward model, is I have some models of anatomy. So these are built from manually delineated subjects. So I know the average shape of a brain. I know how it typically changes between individuals. That allows me to generate randomly different images that all look like anatomical labelings. Then I can sort of pretend that I'm in a scanner and I can tweak the acquisition parameters. I can say, for instance, do I want the fluid to be bright or do I want it to be dark? There's some imaging artifacts that we know always exist. You put everything together, then you get an image. Once you get the image, then you can invert the model. You get a segmentation. And of course, the trick of these whole models is that now we can actually change the intensity profiles. So I can play with these parameters and automatically still get segmentations out of it. I can change the parameters. I can, instead of having one image, maybe I acquired 4 different contrasts, and that will work. And of course, if we're in a hospital, we have some diseases going on. That's also convenient. We just have different shape models of how lesions look like, for instance, brain tumors. And these, importantly, these are trained on completely different individuals. So we don't start from scratch. We have this whole machinery that we can just plug and play and make different combinations to overcome this sort of imaging zoo problem. Here's an example of applying these techniques. So what you see is a post-operative scan taken in Copenhagen. So in that hospital, they decide to use 3 different contrasts. That's a scan after the surgeons have gone in and tried to remove as much of the tumor as possible. And then you can, with these tools, without knowing anything about the settings of the scanner or what sort of acquisition was decided on, you can get an automatic segmentation, both of the tumor and of many other different structures. And there's sort of 2 main applications that I want to mention. One is radiation therapy planning. So you want to radiate the tumor, but you also want to avoid hitting eyeballs, etc. The other application is you can try to predict how long individual patients are going to survive. And that's shown in the graph there. So you can see on the horizontal axis is the time, and the vertical axis is the fraction of patients that are still alive after that time. And obviously you see in the beginning everybody's alive, and after 3 years almost nobody has survived. And so what's interesting is that based on these segmentations, analyzing the shape of different structures, you can actually pull the patient group apart into 2 groups, people that are going to live relatively long and people that are really short survivors. And that's obviously very useful clinical information. So I'll conclude with another example about interpretability. So here the setting is, you get an image and you need to predict something. For instance, a diagnosis, is this treatment working for this specific patient or should we switch treatment? And the example I'm giving here is just very simple. I give a brain scan, what's the age of this person? And you'd be surprised how easy it is to accurately estimate your age from a brain scan. So an error of around 2 years is very typical. And so imagine now that instead of having an age prediction, this would be a diagnosis or a prediction of how long you're going to survive. Obviously, the clinician will want to hear more. In order to build trust in the systems, we'll need to find some sort of explanation of these predictions. And one obvious thing to do is just to explain to the clinician what the machine has done. So if you look at these colored pixels there, these are the areas that the computer essentially has used to calculate the predicted age in this case. And that's technically correct. It's a perfectly valid explanation, except that if I show that to clinicians, they will not trust me at all, because these are the wrong areas. Like a human would never, ever look at those areas. So our objective of building trust and giving interpretability to the system is 0. So what can be done? Well, once again, we do analysis by synthesis, so we build a forward model. If you know the age of a person, what sort of images do you expect to see? And if you've done that, then you can obviously invert the model to predict an age from individual subjects. And now you can show explanations that make sense to clinicians. So what is shown there is essentially the effect of age on different structures. So if I were God and I would pick any one of you and want to make you instantaneously 10 years older, these would be the areas that I would sort of start fiddling with inside your head. Okay, to conclude, AI in medical imaging has a lot of potential. As a patient, it allows you to get scanned faster, much more comfortable. You get better scans. You get a better diagnosis and follow-up with better treatment outcomes. As a healthcare provider or a company, these computers can analyze tons of data day in, day out. They don't get stressed or tired. You don't make, hopefully, as many errors. And of course, you can increase the efficiency of the entire workflow. Thank you.
Thank you, Koen. What a fascinating presentation. Aalto-University has been given a specific role in the Finnish society, which is to build the innovation capacity or capability of Finland, building on excellence in research. And I think Koen's work beautifully illustrates that in order to solve the big problems of the world, the big health problems that we're facing going forward, you need both the excellence in research and the impact, and especially connect the two. Now we are moving on to the next speaker, who comes from the same school, the School of Science, but we move on to a very different field, namely the Department of Industrial Engineering and Management, and more specifically to the field of strategic management. I'm afraid I can't be quite as poetic as Matti in his introduction, but I will nevertheless invite the next department head, Jens Smith, on stage to introduce our next speaker. Please, Jens.
Yes, I'm very happy to introduce to you today Jukka Luoma, who is a recently tenured professor of associate professor of strategic management at the Department of Industrial Engineering and Management. And so his research is based on competitive dynamics and model and data-driven decision-making in organizations. And his expertise is actually getting more and more valuable by the day at the moment, because he really understands, and he's really an expert when it comes to digital technologies, and especially AI-based technologies like ChatGPT and their impact on organizations. So there's really a demand for his expertise among managers and among students. So we are actually very happy that we have Jukka on our faculty. And so today he will talk about the topic of the challenge of becoming a data-driven organization, giving us a behavioral perspective. So welcome, Jukka.
So thank you for those kind introduction words. So my topic is about the challenge of becoming a data-driven organization. So I'm interested in why is it challenging for organizations to become data-driven, and what can we do about those challenges. So the talk is based on my own research that I've done in the past. Also, it's informed quite a bit about research I'm currently working on with my collaborators. I also do education work in this space. So I get to talk to a lot of people across different kinds of organizations that are dealing with this very problem. So, and my thinking is actually also influenced quite a bit by those conversations that I've had. So the backdrop of this presentation is the observation that while we have increasing opportunities for using data in organizations, so this is largely due to digitalization, most organizations actually struggle to make good use of those opportunities. So we have many organizations that we can kind of name as these sort of shining examples of data-driven way of operating. So digital platforms being one example. So digital platform use data to not only as part of their product, but also to inform decision making about how they can make their product better. So Booking.com, for example, conducts yearly thousands of experiments online to learn, collect information and learn how they can improve their service.
Or we have companies like Tesco, a retailer, which pioneered the use of loyalty card data to generate customer insights, which then can inform a wide range of decisions from marketing to deciding on what to do about competition. And then we have companies like Moderna in the pharmaceutical industry or Lemonade in the insurance business that are trying to reimagine the core operations of their respective industries through data and AI. And we could go on with this list and come up with other examples of data-driven organizations, but the fact of the matter remains that most organizations are not driven by data. And this is not really because of a lack of trying. So companies and other organizations are increasingly putting money and time and effort into becoming a data-driven organization, but they struggle with the transition. So that is something that I'm interested in my work as a researcher as well as an educator. So how can we help not only the pioneering organizations go even further in the sort of technology frontier, but how can we also help the average organization, so to speak, to make use of these technologies? Because if we think about this problem from like an economy point of view, so the economic productivity will increase when we're able to move the big mass of organization toward using these technologies. So that's something that's kind of interests my own work as a researcher and as an educator. So to give you a little bit of like how I approach this, I don't look at this as a technological problem. So like if I look at this as a technological problem, I would think about the tools that we use. How can we make the tools better? And that's very important. I'm looking at this more from the point of view of the organization. So what is it in the organizational side of things that makes it difficult to become an organization that utilizes data in their decision making and in their operations? And if you look at organizations, there are multiple different options in terms of how you approach this. So you could look at organizational culture, you could look at institutions. My approach is a behavioral approach. What a behavioral approach means is that we're interested in the mental processes of people in the organization as an explanation for what happens in the organization. So that is kind of like a psychological way of looking at organizational behavior. So a person who takes a behavioral approach to the study of organization is usually interested in things like information processing, attention, motivation, decision-making, learning, and using those kinds of concepts and to understand how the organization operates. And that is then the basis for understanding what might be the challenges in becoming a data-driven organization. One of the foundational assumptions behind this behavioral organization theory is bounded rationality. Bounded rationality is basically just the term which describes the situation that we're not perfect in terms of our cognitive ability. So there's only so much information we can process. There's only so far into the future that we can look ahead. There's only so many options that we can consider simultaneously. So that's bounded rationality. And that's, of course, on the surface level, that's the very reason why we want to become data-driven, why we want to use analytics, because the promise of data analytics is that it helps us extend the bounds of our rationality. But it turns out that bounded rationality also has quite profound implications for what organizations look like in general, and that can actually help us understand some of the challenges that organizations have when they're trying to become more data-driven. So I want to talk a little bit about couple of things that organizations might face as challenges when they're trying to become data-driven. The first problem is the hammers and nails problem. The hammers and nails problem describes the situation where we have people who have problems in the organization. So those are the people who want to drive down the nails. And then we have people who are expert in the data area of things. So these are the data analysts, the data scientists, the data engineers who know all about the technological side of things, but they might not have a good understanding of what are the most valuable use cases for data and analytics. So that's the problem we have, is that we have these people who have very intimate understanding of the problem. So these are the salespeople, marketing people, customer service, operations, HR, all the people who are dealing with the problems and issues of the organization. But then they might not have a very good understanding of what are then the technological solutions to this. Now, this is a very natural outcome of specialization because we are boundedly rational, so we cannot comprehend very large problems. So what the organization is essentially a solution to the problem of bounded rationality, so people specialize. But the side effect of specialization is that we get this siloed expertise and siloed knowledge, and that can become an obstacle when we're trying to come up with useful use cases for data and analytics. Then a related problem is that Actually, if you take any organization that's not data-driven and you start finding out what could be good applications for data here, you might not find good use cases. The reason is that when organizations are initially founded and when they initially grow, they do so without any data. They do so without any analytics. So they learn to live without analytics. They learn to live without the data. So when you then come, someone who knows all about what you can do with data, you might not find very good use cases. So if you think about, for example, canonical in the area of marketing, if you think about, for example, customer lifetime value modeling, so you try to predict how valuable different customer groups are to the organization over time, you need to then, once you have the model in place and if everything is working correctly, then you need to create new organizational routines that actually makes use of those predictions. If you don't do that, then the model is just going to sit somewhere and it's not going to be useful for the organization. So in order to have useful use cases for data and analytics, what we need to do is that we need to change the organization somehow. So this usually means creating new routines in the organization, changing old routines. So the organization doesn't have just sitting around a bunch of data science problems that you can go ahead and solve. You have to first invent them, and then you have to oftentimes change the organization to make it more hospitable to data and analytics. But then you get into these traditional problems of change management. So whenever you change an organization, you run into all kinds of problems. People resist the change. People might leave because they don't like it. When there's all the time organizational changes happening, people get frustrated with that. So you want to change the organization to create useful use cases for data and analytics, but that's challenging. It might also be that people's professional identities become jeopardized. So when we say to people that, hey, now we're going to do this using algorithms because they're better than you, then that's going to be a real threat to the professional identity of people in the organization. Or you might need to change incentives because the way in which it's kind of optimal to work around when you have some predictions in use, it might be different from what we did before. You need to change the incentives. So you get all the change management problems when you try to create the use cases for analytics. And that's a big sort of a challenge that we have when organizations try to do this. And this is a big sort of landscape of problems. I think one sort of general idea that we need to take in this is that somehow we need to bring the data and the problems closer together. So we need to bring the people who know about the technological solutions and people who know about the problems of the organization somehow closer together. And this is, of course, a very sort of a general statement, so I try to unpack this with a little bit with a couple of examples. So one idea, how you kind of bring these closer together is accessible analytics. What I mean by this is that the people who are close to the problems would be able to go and look for the data for themselves. So we have these concepts such as self-service analytics, where people in the organization can, for themselves, look for the information that they need instead of going through some data analyst or business intelligence specialist. Now, this, of course, conserves the time and resources of the analytics team, but the secondary benefit of this is that people then can they learn about the data that the organization has, and then also they can perhaps start reimagining, like, what other problems could I solve with this data? As a complementary thing, if an organization wants to become data-driven, I think it's important that people across the organization have some degree of data literacy. So the people have an understanding of what is, in theory, possible to do with data. This doesn't mean that we train people to become statisticians or we train them to become data scientists. This means that we try to help people to have at least a conceptual level of understanding of what are the possibilities of when using data. So if a company wants to be AI-driven, my sort of suggestion would be that all the employees in the organization know what supervised learning means. Not necessarily to train the models themselves, but at least to have some sort of rough understanding of what that means. Because if they have that kind of understanding, they're better able to think about how could the data scientist in our organization help us. Can we articulate the problems that we have in a way and have more meaningful communication with the technical specialists? And then thirdly, I think is very, very important, is the importance of domain knowledge for the analytics experts. So the people who have the technical skills should spend a lot of time and effort learning about the organization and about the problems that people in the organization have. So they should go around in the organization talking to people and trying to learn what their problems are so that they can think about what are actually the most useful use cases for analytics in the organization. And similarly, if an organization goes and buys some analytics consultancy services from the outside, I think it's a good idea to look into that consultant's expertise, not only in terms of the technical side of things, but also in terms of have they served similar organizations in the past? Do they have experience of your industry? Because that knowledge is actually the critical part when you are trying to figure out the useful applications for data analytics. I just want to conclude with this sort of a general observation about the pace of technological change and organizational change. So the reality is that technology always changes more rapidly than organizations. So there's all the time new technologies coming and going, and organizations are relatively slow to change and adapt. This applies to technologies related to data, but I think it applies to other technologies as well. And oftentimes, like I just discussed with the case of data analytics, you actually need to change the organization in order to create the useful use cases for the new technology. Now, the implications of this is that whenever there's a new technology, there's usually huge initial excitement about the possibilities, and then there's disappointment. This disappointment is just a sort of a natural outcome of the fact that technology changes more rapidly an organization, where we often need to change the organization in order to create the useful use cases for the new technology. So we shouldn't be so surprised if our initial attempts to adopt new technologies fail. So if you first don't succeed, dust yourself up and try again. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jukka. Such a topical presentation. Topical, in fact, also for Aalto University when we are trying to move our digitalization development plans forward. Jukka is also a very great example of multidisciplinarity. As you know, Aalto is a multidisciplinary university combining technology, business, and art and design. And Jukka has a background in both technology and in business, and is working at the intersection of the two. So, and you can see the results of that kind of multidisciplinary work and the impact that it has for society. Now we move on to a different school, which is indeed in the business domain, or in fact in the societal domain, namely the School of Business and the Department of Economics. Another hugely impactful professor doing societally important work, and this person will be introduced by the head of department of the Department of Economics, Matti Liski. Please, Matti.
Thank you, Kristiina. It's like a second Christmas for the head of the department to have this opportunity to present newly tenured professor joining the faculty. I have this pleasure today to introduce Matti Sarvimäki, who is a labor economist, but working on a broad range of topics in general economics, including social mobility, migration, trade, and the impact of trade on labor markets. But he's also working on large multidisciplinary projects on education, for example. I'm sure you will hear about that in the talk. Matti is our own product from the very beginning, but he has had long research visits to MIT on a rather regular basis, to London School of Economics, and he has been a part-time research professor at VAT Research Institute for Economic Research. For a professor, it's good to ask that what you're known for. And Matti is not known only for being a Matti, but he's He is known for being a great teacher. He is an award-winning teacher, very committed and popular supervisor among students. He has already during his junior years he's been running large research projects, and he is very central in his field of research, migration in particular, and in policy circles. So he's like a household name for policymakers on, for example, topics related to migration. So putting all this together, we have a researcher who is very impactful, having a very impressive profile that we are celebrating today. And with these words, I'm inviting Matti to give his talk on experiments, some of them intended, others not. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Matti, for this overly kind introduction. So today I want to tell you about how economists approach causal questions nowadays. And let me start by noting that this approach is really traditional in many ways, but it's actually quite different than what economists used to do like 30 years ago. It's widely seen to be an important change within economics. Actually, some people call it the credibility revolution in economics. And, you know, even if you don't like such bombastic expressions, it is certainly true that if you pick up an economics journal today and read an empirical paper, it looks quite different than it would have looked like 30 years ago. And actually, it looks much simpler. It's much easier to understand. It's much more transparent. And that I think is good news for economics. It's good news for when you try to influence a policy or help policymakers to make better decisions. So it's something really exciting that I want to share with you, and the easiest way to do that is through a few examples. And you know, it's my installation talk, so I thought it's appropriate to use my own work as examples. So let me say a few words about how I see my research agenda. I've studied kind of too many things, but I think I can argue that a lot of them are about thinking how to unleash human potential. So by human potential, I mean the kind of the best version of ourselves, kind of what each one of us could accomplish if we had a chance to develop our skills under the best possible circumstances and to put those skills to work. And you know, sadly, this potential often gets wasted. Many people grow up without access to good education or even to sufficient nutrition. And hence this potential doesn't turn to actual skills. And even the skills that people do acquire, they often don't get to use them because they say they can live in places with few job opportunities, they can be discriminated against in the labor market, or for a number of other reasons. And that's kind of depressing, right? But the good news is that things have gotten and can get even further better than what they have been. And this is partly because better policy. And I will try to argue that researchers can have an important role in making that policy even better than what it is today. So with that, let me move to my first example. So this starts with the spatial misallocation hypothesis. And that's a hypothesis based on the simple but important observation that if you think about what's the best predictor of somebody's income, by far, the answer is where that person lives. Observationally identical people living in different places have vastly different incomes and productivities. This is true between rich countries and poor countries, but also within countries between regions, in particular in developing countries between rural and urban areas. And that kind of suggests that many people are living in wrong places in the sense that if we would help them to move, or at least allow them to move to more productive places, it would make a big difference. But before we jump into that conclusion, we do have to stop and wonder whether that observation, these differences that we observe between, say, people living in rural and urban areas, do they really capture the effect of migration? Because people choose to migrate. It's not, people who take the risk of moving to a city are different than those who stay behind in many ways. And hence, comparing them can be this apples and oranges comparison. So what we really want to do here is to answer a causal question. If we would, how would Y, say income, change if we change some X, say whether the person lives in rural or urban area? So let's think about somebody who has migrated to the city. How can we tell whether this move increased her income? Well, we can go to the city, we can find her, and we can measure her income. But that alone doesn't tell us really much about the effect. What we really want to do is to compare what she actually earns in the city to what she, the same person, would have earned had she not moved to the city. And that's the tricky thing to do because it's counterfactual. What would have happened? But we can't measure it because it didn't happen. So that's really what all impact evaluation is about. How do we construct an approximation of that counterfactual? What would have happened? And there's basically two ways to do this. The traditional way in economics is to build a model, use that model to simulate different states of the world, and then you learn how those states of the world differ from each other. And that's really powerful, really wonderful thing to do. But it does come with this important limitation that every model has a bunch of many assumptions. And those assumptions are going to be wrong in some sense, always. And the question is, are they so wrong that we end up drawing wrong conclusions? And that's a really hard thing to assess. So during the past 3 decades, economists have also complemented this approach with an alternative approach of basically trying to find control groups. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. How do we find good research designs where we can make apples-to-apples comparisons? And those control groups can then capture all the complexities in the world that affect people, things that are not related to the thing that we actually want to study. So the classic research design is a randomized experiment. And the power of that is that we know that the treatment group and the control group are going to be similar in every other aspect except that treatment group gets some treatment and the control group does not. So let's think about this question of returns to migration. What would be the kind of ideal experiment that would allow us to answer that question? Well, we can think about taking, say, 100,000 individuals, flipping a coin with each one of them. You get heads, you go to city, you get tails, you stay in the countryside. Then we measure their income over, say, next 20 years and see what happens. Okay, to be clear, I don't advocate running that experiment. It would be a horrible thing to do. It should not be done. So why am I talking about it? Well, thinking about these hypothetical experiments helps you understand that sometimes something resembling them takes place. These quasi-experiments or natural experiments, unintended experiments, they can provide really powerful lessons. So one example that I have used in my own work started in 1939, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland and took over the eastern parts of the country. 1/10 of the population had to be evacuated, and each person was moved to an evacuation area where the local families would host them for over the winter. And then in the spring and summer, Finland implemented this remarkable resettlement policy, where displaced people would be compensated for their lost property. And the most important form of property at the time was agricultural land. Half of the population worked in agriculture, and that's what was then given to farmers. If you were a farmer, you would get land and assistance to start a new farm. And it really was a remarkable policy. It aimed to reconstruct the pre-war situation as closely as possible. So the location you would get land from would be determined from where you came from to match the soil quality, to match the average temperatures there. You would get your old neighbors with you in order to preserve social connections. And then you would have your farm. And you would be free to do whatever you wanted. You could sell it, you could stay. That was your choice. So in work together with Roope Uusitalo and Markus Jäntti, we've been trying to understand what was the effect of being forced to migrate. And the main result is here. So this is put together using data that follows people over several censuses and links them their tax records to this data. So it's data where we know where these people used to live before the war. And that's the horizontal axis here. For each person we ask, how far away was the home municipality before the war from the post-war border? And there's the 0 point here, that's the new border, our current border. Everybody to the right of that had to move. On the vertical axis, we have income in 1971. And what we see in this graph is that there's this gradient. We move from west to east in Finland, the incomes tend to go down. But then there's this big discontinuity at the new border. Farmers who were forced to migrate ended up earning substantially more later on. So how come? Well, we think the answer is in this graph. This is exactly the same as the one before, but now the vertical axis tells us the share of people who have moved from agriculture to urban areas to work mostly in manufacturing. And this is what we see. The people who were forced to migrate were much more likely to leave agriculture and move to the cities where the wages were much higher. Putting these two graphs together implies that leaving agriculture increased income substantially, almost roughly like 70% in the mid-20th century Finland. So then the question actually is, if it's so lucrative to move, why don't people move? I mean, 70% increase in your income, that sounds like a wonderful thing. The way we interpret this is that there must be big costs. It's not that everybody are making the mistake, but it's costly to migrate. And it became less costly to migrate for the forced migrants, basically because they couldn't stay at home anymore. This is like an obvious point for, if you're not an economist, that people really value staying at home. And that's something we need to take into account when we think about, say, how do we think about regional policies today. Okay, so that's a kind of a tough example, and so let me talk about something that's much more fun. So now we get colors. Let's talk about children, preschool, fun. And this goes back to where I started about how human potential gets turned into actual skills. And an important part of that process takes place in school. And an important part of the education policy is to decide, for example, when school starts. And as you know, in Finland today, school kind of starts with the preschool at the year when the child turns 6 years old, and then you go to kind of real school a year after that. And what we observe is that children start that real school with quite different initial skills. And that can be a worry. It is a worry that some kids don't have enough initial skills to really benefit from school. And this is a worry that our outgoing government also shared. So when they were forming the current government or the previous government, one of the things they wrote into their agenda is that there needs to be a pilot for 2-year preschool. What would happen? Would it be better if kids would start school at age 5 or preschool at age 5, stay there for 2 years and have kind of a more structured, still a lot of playing, but still somewhat more structured education before they start school. So is this a good idea? Well, that's what you need the pilot for, right? To think about, is it a good idea? But how would you actually do it? So again, we can think of an experiment that would settle the matter. So let's take 30,000 children, randomize them into treatment and control. The treatment starts preschool at age 5, the control at age 6. And let's see what happens. Now, it sounds a bit fanciful to do something like this, but we got asked what should we do, and this is what we told. And to my great surprise, that's what the government did. So 15,000 families have gotten a letter like this during the past 2 years, telling them that congratulations, your child starts preschool at age 5, so we expect you to show up here next fall. 20,000 families have gotten a less colorful letter saying that your child is part of a control group and nothing really changes. That's a big thing. We are really kind of altering the way these children's lives. We need to do that responsibly. And the way it was implemented was that the government or the parliament set a special law just for this experiment. That law that was a normal process of making sure that that law is kind of okay. It also came with 30 million euro budget and ability to use data in ways that wouldn't be possible without the law. And now in 2025, we will actually know, is it a good idea or what's the kind of cost benefits of extending preschool by 1 year. So I hope these 2 examples give you some sense of how exciting it is to be an empirical economist today. There's these new approaches, new data sources, new collaboration, and this opportunity to do great science, which also directly speaks to policy. So if you want to hear more, you can find me and my colleagues from the 3rd floor of the business school. Thank you.
Thank you, Matti. It was indeed exciting. And Matti is in fact a great example of the 3 domains that we have here in academia. Our tasks are education, research, and impact. And I think Matti's work and the examples he gave were prime examples of that. And we are really looking forward to the next government period when we get to do more experiments, and also looking forward to the results of this one. Now we move on to another school again, the School of Chemical Engineering, and I know that there will be another very interesting and impactful presentation coming up. This namely comes from the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems, and I have the pleasure of inviting the head of department of that department, Monika Österberg, on stage. Please, Monika.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Tiina Nypelö. So Tiina received the degree of Doctor of Science in Forest Products Chemistry from Aalto University, so from our department, in 2012. After that, she spent a longer time abroad getting different skills. So she started with 2 postdoctoral periods. The first one in North Carolina State University in 2012 to 14, and then in University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences, BOKU, in Vienna, Austria. In 2017, she got a professorship in Chalmers University of Technology. First, she was as assistant professor, and in 21 as associate professor. And she was at the same time also associated to Wallenberg Wood Science Center. Now, in the beginning of this year, we had the pleasure of welcoming her back, our experienced alumni, and she was appointed associate professor at Aalto University and our department. And she's a well-known expert in hemicellulose chemistry and lignocellulose chemistry in general, and that's also her research interest. She is also very interested in biorefinery, and today we will hear her talk about her ideas about resource-efficient materials biorefinery. So welcome, Tiina.
So, good afternoon. €14.6 billion, that was the total value of exported forest industry products 2022 from Finland. And that also accounted for 18% of the total value of all exported goods 2022 from Finland. And if we think about what kind of items are these, paperboard, paper pulp, chemicals, and so on goods, they can be counted into these values. If we think more in relation to our everyday life, this would be materials such as boxes, packaging that are holding your items at home, wipes, hygiene products, also some chemicals that are helping us in our households to viscosify certain products. So in a way, many of these materials would be items that we use on everyday basis. And this everyday basis use brings about volume to these materials. And when we think about voluminous products, voluminous materials, we have to trust that behind those there are well thought through and efficient ways of making them. So efficient processes. And in these voluminous processes, we also need to bear in mind that any small changes or small alterations in these voluminous processes will have a large effect. So in a way, we are talking about materials, streams that have impact. When we think about impact in our everyday life, also in the society, of course, there is a third word that we have to add here. It's the responsibility. And if I would now try to verbalize to you what I mean with the responsibility within this field, within this industry, within the research that we do, it would be to stay relevant to the needs of the consumers. It would be also to stay relevant to the legislative work, policy work that's ongoing, that's looking forward to the future and how we develop this area. And so within the forest products, what has been my take, what has been my chosen path, it has been to look into the biomass as a resource of materials streams. So in a way, this would mean then we take the forest biomass, we want to take it in parts, so in different kinds of parts, and then use these streams. And what kind of streams do we have? We have fibers, we have other kinds of particles, we also have polymers. Within those polymer streams, we have three candidates, so we have three actors in the palette. We have cellulose, we have lignins, and we have hemicelluloses. And for a long time we've been, or our eyes has been on cellulose, because it makes majority of this resource. And because it's also so integral to the fibers that we can liberate from this resource, and we are using for many of those paper products. But at this moment, we are standing in front of a situation where we have to think that cellulose only makes half of the material, right? So if we are somehow thinking about resource efficiency, then of course it would be in our interest to also focus our interests to the other streams. When we are thinking about any changes or shift of focus within this field, and now I want to remind you of the volume, we of course need to keep in mind that these changes, these iterations, these new endeavors that we are going to go and embark on, they always have to hold hands with the processing aspect. So I would like to give you a little view on the utilization of the hemicellulose fraction, because this has been something that has been of interest to me. So what kind of opportunities can we think there? How can we start to think about expanding the percentage that we are taking use from our resources? So there are some typical or some popular utilization strategies. For example, liberate the hemicelluloses, extract them out from the biomass. We can do it very easily. We can take acids, they will break the molecule smaller, they will leave. We can take alkali, it will dissolve the molecules, again they will leave. We will have extracts. Maybe the challenges here lie then on purification of these extracts. What does it cost? As well as what will we use this for? Then of course there is a chemical route. We can liberate the hemicelluloses as well as any other material from the bioresources and use the elements to construct new chemicals. We can also, of course, think about the fibers, the ones that we have had our eyes on for such a long time, and try to pump the fibers with, for example, with the hemicelluloses to increase then the yield and the usage. For me here in this context, I've been quite interested in polymers, so in the hemicelluloses as polymers. And when we think about the polymers, they have a couple of, or quite many interesting properties, but many of their intriguing properties relate to how they are in solvents, what kind of properties and what kind of a volume and what kind of a conformation do they take in solvents. So with all polymers as well as with the wood polymers, we can think about, for example, solubility. Are these molecules soluble? Are they insoluble? As well as how this solubility can be controlled with respect to pH, with respect to temperature, how does it change? If we get wild and we want to make it more complicated, we can even introduce not only one of the polymers, but take another polymer, yeah? And then you want to consider, how are these two polymers in a solvent? Do they like each other? Do they separate one from one another? Do they like the solvent? Which one likes the solvent more? And these might seem like curiosity-driven questions, quite far from the reality. However, when we think about the processes and this industry, we are very often dealing with solvent-rich systems. So we have material streams that are rich in solvents, and we are in the process of processing those streams. So their control of solubility, miscibility, separation of different fractions can be quite central when we think about fractionation. So in fractionation, we want to separate two fractions. Or we are thinking about recovery. So we want to keep one, we want to separate the other one, and perhaps then cycle the material, as well as in yield. So when we want to make sure we are making the most of a material. So the biomass, it's a chemical and a physically interlinked network. And if we stand in front of that challenge that we want to take it in part, so we want to fractionate it, we want to release these precious material streams, then all those details and knowledge of the details of the structure of the biomass, forest biomass, becomes very relevant. And it becomes increasingly relevant when we are thinking about breaking bonds and liberating these materials. And then, of course, it's a question of how much of chemical energy and how much of mechanical energy must we put in? Or maybe even more a question, how little of this energy must we put in to liberate these precious material streams? And this then circles back to these three items: the volume, the impact, as well as the responsibility. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tiina. Aalto has expressed its purpose as shaping a sustainable future, and I think the work that Tiina and her colleagues are doing with bioproducts and biomaterials is a hugely important part of that going forward. Now, we've heard 4 brilliant presentations from 4 brilliant people. Let's give them a big hand once more. And we're moving on to the next part, which I'm sure everyone will be very much looking forward to. That's namely networking and cocktails. We are moving just next door or even in this space and have a more informal part of the afternoon. Please make sure that you go and congratulate each of the new professors, get to know more people within Aalto and outside, and enjoy the afternoon. Thank you very much for this event, and have a wonderful Vappu week. Thank you.